Okay, everybody, we're just going to take a minute to allow more people in before we start. In the meantime, let us know where you're from in the chat. We always like to see that. It's nice for us. And we'll start in just a minute. Okay, again, if you're so inclined, let us know where you're from in the chat. Again, we always like to see that. And I think we can go ahead and begin. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief, and I'm happy to be here with you today for Dogen's Last Text, An Evolution or a Radical Change with Stephen Heine. Now, that's a paper that Professor Heine wrote, and we will be putting it in the chat throughout this hour for you to download if you'd like. This is a Tricycle Premium event, so a special welcome to our premium subscribers. If you're not a premium subscriber, you can subscribe at tricycle.org/subscribe. We hold these events monthly. Tricycle is a nonprofit, and if you'd like to learn more about our mission or donate to Tricycle, visit tricycle.org/donate. We'll be leaving time for questions at the end of this hour-long session. You can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. You can ask questions as you listen, and when we get to the questions, we'll start asking Professor Heine. Today's Zoom session will be recorded. We will share the replay link in a follow-up email. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Heine, a professor of religious studies and history and the founding director of the Institute for Asian Studies at Florida International University. He has published 40 monographs and co-edited books on East Asian religions and society, especially involving the spread of Zen Buddhism from China to medieval Japan. Heine is an authority on the life and thought of Zen Master Dogen, the 13th century founder of Soto Zen. Heine has examined Dogen's major text, the Shobogenzo, in light of his view of koans, philosophy of time, poetry compositions, and use of Chinese sources. Heine's current book project is an analysis of Dogen's final body of writing, the 12 Fascicles Collection, which expresses a view of morality based on reckoning with the law of causality through enacting deeds of repentance. Welcome, Stephen.
How are you? Great to see you today.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. Aside from giving us a brief take on who Dogen was, you wrote a paper called The Shadow of the Whip, Memento Mori in Dogen's 12 Fascicles Collection. Can you explain the main premise or question that the paper poses?
Okay. Well, thank you for the kind introduction and also for that interesting question. Dogen, as many of the participants today will know, is the founder of the Soto Zen sect in medieval Japan, and he's particularly famous for having gone to China in his 20s and being one of the first Japanese Zen teachers to learn Zen directly from Chinese writings and Chinese masters, and transplanting that back to Japan and kind of adopting it and integrating it into the Japanese societal context, which was very interesting and turbulent in the early 13th century, as many new Buddhist sects were taking hold, and Soto Zen was competing against Rinzai Zen, against the Pure Land sects, Nichiren, and other teachings that were developing at that time. And all of those teachings, including Dogen's, were trying to identify themselves and put forward some central ideas. And for Dogen, those central ideas are generally contained in his masterwork, the Shobogenzo, and which consists of different versions, but anywhere from a couple dozen fascicles to up to 75 or 95 fascicles. That's an interesting point in itself. But the Shobogenzo and its teachings primarily focus on shikantaza, just sitting, zazen meditation, as the key to Buddhist practice and training that must be constantly renewed every moment. Now, the text that I'm looking at, the 12 Fascicles text, is something that I first became aware of back in 1975 when I started graduate school and was first studying Dogen. It became more prominent for me 20 years later in the 1990s because of various reasons in Japan. There was a lot of attention being given to that text. And now 30 years later, I've come to revisit it once again. The text I'm talking about, I call the 12 Fascicles Collection. Notice I do not call it the 12 Fascicles version of the Shobogenzo, which is the way it's almost always referred to in Japan and in the scholarship that's been disseminated in the Western world. The reason for that is that I think it's a separate text. It's autonomous. It's independent. It's standalone, and I want to call attention to it in a way so that it's no longer seen as an afterthought, as an addendum, as a supplement to the Shobogenzo. So when it's seen as a addendum or supplement to the main Shobogenzo, it appears to be very quirky text because it contradicts much of the Shobogenzo. Shobogenzo focuses on zazen, shikantaza, meditation, and a philosophy that I would refer to as non-dualism, paradoxical. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to confirm all things. That kind of dialectical negation leading to a paradoxical non-dual view expressed in the Genjo Koan fascicle epitomizes the Shobogenzo philosophy. Shobogenzo philosophy also talks a lot about the Buddha nature, Genjo Koan, seeing all things at once, spontaneous realization, Shinjin Datsuraku, or casting off body mind, and none of that terminology appears in the 12 fascicles. The 12 fascicles very rarely quotes Zen sayings, but rather it quotes early Buddhism that had been translated into Chinese sources and early Mahayana Chinese Buddhist commentaries on the early Buddhist sources. So it has a different lexicon. It has a different vocabulary. It uses terminology like wholesome or unwholesome roots of behavior, sowing the seeds of good karma through creating merit and repentance. Now, is that contradictory to the Shobogenzo and Shikantaza, or is it consistent? And I think the title that you guys framed here, Evolution or Radical Departure, sums it up very nicely. In the Japanese context that includes scholars, practitioners, and many of them are scholar practitioners in Japan, this has been debated very fiercely for over 30 years. And the traditionalist camp views consistency and still, I think, kind of insists that the 12 fascicles are a complement to the main Shobogenzo. But the reformers, particularly known as critical Buddhism, look at it quite differently. They say Dogen deliberately had a change of heart late in his life. He had had an encounter with the shogun, where the shogun kind of offered him and some rewards, like he would build a big temple for Dogen. And, Dogen interpreted that as giving into being co-opted by secular fame and fortune. Dogen declined. He returned to his Heiji temple in the mountains, on the remote mountains. And it seemed like as soon as he returned from that trip, and during the last 5 years of his life, he had a change of heart. And I'm trying to look at this debate as in a neutral way. I don't want to take too many sides. I'm trying to look for the compromise standpoint, and I'm trying to look for the underlying essence of Dogen without regards to that apparent polarity between early Dogen and late Dogen. But I do feel that Dogen is making a point about ethics, about karma, that he feels is true to basic Buddhism, that he feels fulfills his teacher, his Chinese teacher, Ru Jing's injunction when you return to Japan, teach people Buddhism, don't use labels, don't necessarily use Zen as a label, teach people how to become home leavers, practice the path of Buddhism, take the precepts, and become meritorious. And so I'm trying to interpret the reasons for that. I also want to see Dogen in the context of medieval Japanese Buddhism, where the idea of last days, your final thoughts, your final actions, how you approach death. There's special terminology for that in Japanese Buddhism. Linju, facing the final days, how that affected many of the leading thinkers of Japanese Buddhism, including Dogen. And I also want to see Dogen in light of broader worldwide philosophical, poetic, and religious views on facing death, injunctions for example, the American 19th century movement, the Shakers would say, build a chair and make it like it's going to last forever, but that this is the last day of your life and you have to make it perfect right now. So I think Dogen has a certain view of time and temporality and facing mortality that rings true with other kinds of philosophy and religious teachings, and at the same time is not inconsistent with his earlier approach, because Dogen was always very sensitive to impermanence, fleeting, transient quality of existence.
One striking thing about these 12 fascicles is they seem to be drawing from the earlier Sanskrit canon more than they do, say, you mentioned wholesome, unwholesome, than they do, say, the Chan literature. Can you say something about that? Because it, for many, does seem like a discontinuous break, although I certainly understand the continuity that you argue for. Could you say something about that? He's drawing from two different traditions, really.
Yes, because Dogen in the Shobogenzo is primarily known for introducing and translating into Japanese the Chinese sources. So if we imagine Dogen's time period, many of his followers in Japan were somewhat familiar, not so familiar. Only a handful probably were experts in Chinese. And this was one of Dogen's claims to fame, that he had mastered Chinese Zen sources. And he tried to introduce it very quickly. And one of the fascinating things is that he would cite it in Japanese and give in Chinese, and then give a Japanese kind of translation, interpretation in the text. And it's very exciting to see how he rereads and introduces and interprets that material. But what is the essence of that material? The essence of that material is practicing a standpoint based on non-dualism, overcoming all dualities. And Dogen coined many famous terms: the oneness of practice realization, the unity of past, present, and future, the unity of Buddha nature and all beings, the oneness of all forms of practice and the goals of practice. So Dogen seemed to be focusing on the non-duality over and over again. So now in the 12 fascicles, he leaves that behind. If he cites it at all, it's usually in a critical sense. He's mildly critical of Sixth Patriarch Huineng in one of the fascicles. He doesn't even bother with citings and teachings very much. So what happened to him at that time? Well, one historical point we know is that he received a gift from a donor, from a patron, of a new version of the Taisho, of the Tripitaka, of the full Buddhist canon. And maybe what he had read earlier kind of focused on Zen and recent Mahayana teachings, and he was being exposed for the first time in these last few years of his life to the early Buddhist canon, which he hadn't had the opportunity to read because it was not taken so seriously in the Japanese context. Or he made a deliberate decision: I'm not concerned with the Zen label. I want to look at the essence of what Buddhism teaches. Now, one of the texts that he quotes is a sutra that is ascribed to Shakyamuni as the last sermon Shakyamuni gave before he entered parinirvana. And he said in that sutra, the famous saying that, when I'm gone, when the Buddha is gone, turn to the Dharma, turn to the practice. And Dogen refers to the dignified demeanor as key to the practice in the 12 fascicles. So I think that that in his vision, he's returning to the essence of Buddhism and how that modifies our understanding or inspires our understanding of last days.
So usually we associate Dogen with paradox, koan, shikintaza, just sitting, as central to the tradition. Can you talk a little more about what the very distinct emphasis in the 12 fascicles is?
Yeah. Okay, good question. Now, in the Shobogenzo, one of the famous fascicles is called Shoaku Maksa, do not a non-production of evil, or do not commit anything evil. And that's one of the, and that was written early, kind of mid-career by Dogen, and it's often pointed to as his approach to ethics because obviously it deals with the idea of mitigating evil. But he, in that, he does say non-dualistically that the non-production of good and evil leads us to a unity beyond polarities, so that good versus evil is somehow transcended. And so the idea, and this is what is brought out by the school known as critical Buddhism, that particularly highlighted the change of heart that they felt Dogen had at in the 12 Classical Collection. That in the earlier one, even when he was trying to be addressing the realm of ethics, he couldn't help but fall back. And Dogen himself, they say, recognized this later in life. He kind of fell back on the non-dualism rhetoric without being able to break away from it. But then when he starts writing the 12 fascicle, it's very clear cut. There's wholesome and unwholesome behavior. We have behavioral roots that can lead in either direction, and it's our choice. Our choice is conditioned by the receiving merits from Buddhas and the Dharma, and it's enhanced by taking the precepts and taking refuge in the three treasures. But it's a clear-cut dualistic choice. I think it's fair to say that the philosophy of the 12 fascicles, drawing on the Indian sources, bypassing the Chan or Zen sources in that last stage of Dogen's life, has a distinctively dualistic view that there is a choice between good and evil, and evil can't be fully overcome. But if there is a genuine sense of repentance, then the effects of evil will be mitigated, and that will allow us to cultivate the wholesome behavioral roots, and as they cultivate, they will flourish. But I think another aspect of the 12 Fascicle Collection is that, drawing from the Indian worldview, Dogen does not talk any longer about realization here and now, about finding enlightenment in the immediate present moment.
So just before I continue with the questions, why don't you say something about the provenance of the 12 fascicles as a collection? I mean, 11 of them existed prior to their discovery as a collection, which give them more, I guess, emphasis. So can you say something about how they disappeared and were rediscovered as a collection?
Right. So I refer to it as the long-lost last collection of Dogen. Is it really the last one? Well, that argument can be debated a little bit, because only one of the 12 has is clearly dated, and there's some question marks about the other ones. Although we do know that Ejo, Dogen's main disciple, his lifelong scribe and confidant, 2 years after Dogen died in 1253, 2 summers later, Ejo edited 12 fascicles and proclaimed them to be a kind of unified textual entity, and made a very bold statement that this is what Dogen valued the most, and he advises everyone to copy it and thereby cherish and uphold the 12 fascicles. So that textual evidence is there, but the interesting point is that this was done 2 years after Dogen died. So we don't know for sure what Dogen's intention was. We only have Ejo's, secondhand comment. As much as well as he knew Dogen, how reliable, it may or may not be totally reliable. And then the text was apparently lost for several hundred years. 7 fascicles were included in one version, the 75 version of the Shobogenzo. 4 of them were included in the another version, the 60 version. And that lasted for a couple centuries. In the 1690s was the first time they decided to put together the 95 fascicles, and 11 of them appeared in the same group, but they weren't in the same sequence. They weren't in one unified text. So people figured that what we now call the 12 fascicles were just scattered fascicles that were part of the Shobogenzo. And then there was a discovery of a manuscript from the 1420s that said, and the postscript for this manuscript said that, this is the 12 fascicle text written by Dogen. I am honoring Dogen by making this copy. So all of a sudden, a kind of revolution in thinking about Dogen and the Shobogenzo kind of exploded in Japan. And from 1927, at the time of that discovery of the 15th century text, through the ensuing decades, there were the debates about why this existed as something separate and overlooked were very much current in the Japanese world of Dogen studies. And it's still being debated, and there's still many different theories. I'm sympathetic to the compromise view that Dogen had a gradual radical departure, let's say, that he, and Dogen is such a complicated, multifaceted figure. We don't want to pigeonhole him to he said this or that, and he was a kind of stubborn, contrarian, intellectual in some ways. That when you pinned him down, he could flip things around and say the opposite. That's not so unusual. It's also not so unusual in the history of Dogen studies that there were discoveries in archives of lost manuscripts, different versions of manuscripts. For a long time, people said that Dogen wasn't interested in koans. And then in the 20th century, they found that he had a collection of 300 koans. And so that also caused the kind of revolution.
Maybe this is too speculative, so tell me if it is, but you imagine this man at the end of his life who's given these remarkable teachings, and sometimes the 12 fascicles can seem like a corrective, as if there were a tad of regret. Maybe there was a risk to his earlier teachings that he wanted to kind of rein in. Does that make sense?
Yes. That's what the critical Buddhism approach is saying, that it's a corrective, that he understood that he was struggling himself, that he was very much influenced by the Tendai school of Buddhism in Japan, by various Mahayana Buddhist teachings about Buddha nature, and that he was kind of overwhelmed by those, and it took him a long time to sort out what he really felt, and then at the end he corrects it. As you were bringing up that, I was thinking of a scene in a famous movie called Inherit the Wind that many years ago, where there was a story of the trial, a so-called monkey trial, about whether you could teach evolution in the schools. And the famous lawyer who seemed like an atheist, agnostic, because he was refuting biblical theory. At the last scene of the movie, he walks along with the Bible and Darwin in holding them in one hand, and they go together. So in a way, maybe we could hold Dogen's Shobogenzo and the 12 Fascicle Collection in one hand. It's a tad of a corrective. It brings us in a certain direction, but at the same time, he's not denying the capacity for shikantaza. I'm sure that he was still practicing shikantaza, and he was vigorously, instructing his disciples in it to the very end. So it's not a repudiation, but a corrective, I think, is a very good way to put it.
So some Zen teaching suggests that since all beings are inherently awakened, there's no need to purify one's karma.
Yeah.
Dogen seems to say the opposite. How should we reconcile these views?
Yeah. Yes. And so going back to the Showaku Makusa fascicle, do not commit evil, or the non-production of evil. Yeah, Dogen seems to embrace that view. Look, everything's empty, so good and evil is empty. Those categories don't really exist. That's a fantasy. That's a product of our delusion. But when you're facing ethical choices, and in his case, when he's facing the choice of whether to accept a gift from the shogun, who he feels is a corrupted secular figure that is only making a pretense of being interested in the Dharma, and that it would ruin his whole legacy. He had to make that choice. There's a famous story that when Dogen returned from that visit to the mountains, that one of his disciples, who was in his entourage visiting the shogun, stayed behind to settle some personal affairs, and then apparently returned to Dogen a few weeks later and said, guess what? I accepted this gift from the shogun after all. And Dogen had this monk excommunicated, and they ripped up his meditation platform and threw it away, and burned it, and burned his clothes and possessions, and said that nobody could ever sit in that meditation spot ever again because this person disobeyed it. Now, Dogen also had a compassionate, kind-hearted, grandmotherly, loving kindness side as well, as we can see in some of his writings. But I think he was very strict and stern that ethical choices do need to be made. Yeah.
Yeah, when I mentioned that for some it may sound like a discontinuous break, you hinted at this notion of continuity. Can you just clarify a little bit how this might seem to be part of a whole? You refer to it to some extent, but I just wonder sometimes, like I said before, they seem so different, or maybe they just seem different from our common conception of Zen in the West. But you're seeing continuity in a lot of places.
Right. Well, yes, I think the argument for continuity is that, well, there are different stages of Dogen's life. So as a kind of, young, brash, upstart, he was going to have a certain attitude, and then, later in life, he's going to mellow and not be as paradoxical and as trying to create writings that are so deliberately complex and perplexing, and kind of give a more straightforward exposition of basic Buddhist teachings. Another theory is that, well, the Shobogenzo was for advanced monks in training who know the Chinese well enough to get his puns and word plays and kind of philosophical jokes that are embedded in some of that writing. And this is laying it out for novices and lay practitioners so that they can see quite clearly. So you can have two sides of the same coin, according to the continuity view. And the Dharma needs to be taught at different levels, and sometimes the Dharma is taught in a straightforward way, and sometimes it's taught in a, I think of the Emily Dickinson line, "Truth, teach the truth, tell the truth, but tell it slant." Like sometimes you can't tell the direct thing. But which one is the direct and which one is the indirect? That's the question. Which one takes priority? In the end, I think we do have to choose between those two paths. So what, my goal, and I'm working on the book project for this now, is to kind of flesh out the argument further by looking at some of the historical issues you brought up, the provenance. What is the evidence for when it was written? If we can document that, hey, this was written late, then why? It's a legacy text. Now, another way to look at it, and here I'm drawing from some recent theories in art and literary criticism. A lot of great artists and writers and musicians and thinkers have a late stage. Beethoven's works after he was deaf is one of the prominent examples. Picasso's many stages. So there's a late style approach in recent artistic criticism that we may have to evaluate what was done at the end of a amazing figure's life by a little bit different standards. So that's another kind of, I look at that as kind of a compromise view. Can we have our cake and eat it too with Dogen? Whichever one of the two we like, and we see the flip side of it. But there's the stirring, inspirational, amazing, paradoxical display of pyrotechnical rhetoric that Dogen has in Shobogenzo. And then there's the calm, straightforward, even-handed, step-by-step sequential teaching of recognize your transgressions, repent before it's too late approach of the late Dogen.
So when you say perhaps we'll discover they were written later, do you mean after Dogen or just later in his life?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Is there any question as to whether or not these were actually?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, could later editors have kind of intruded into this system and what was Dogen or what wasn't Dogen? So not much is available in Dogen's own hand, although we do have some of Dogen's own calligraphy available. And since these were primarily edited after that 2-year span after Dogen by his disciple Ejo, you can't help but raise question marks. So did Ejo, did his disciples kind of mold this in a certain way? On the other hand, I think it is clear that that Dogen was trying something different. He was putting together this new body of work. He got sick, and the last few months of his life, he was not able to complete it. But he got as close as possible. So I don't think that I don't think there's an argument for, like this is fraudulent. Some people have argued. I mean, that argument has come up with some texts by Dogen and other medieval thinkers, because it's always an issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, either way, it's interesting to me because a tradition really belongs to a whole culture. So
Yeah.
Clearly, this was a concern either way. And what was that concern? I mean, what about the potentially antinomian bent of Zen in Soto Zen, the dismissal of any rules or ethics, or the transcending of those rules and ethics?
Yeah.
So that clearly became a concern. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think it did. And going back to the issue of the Shogun, I want to mention a film that's probably well known to our participants today. It's called Zen. It came out in 2009. It's kind of a biopic that was made about Dogen, and it's readily available on the internet. And they do have, for about 20 minutes, they do have a very powerful scene where Dogen is teaching the Shogun, and the Shogun seems to sincerely repent for his lifetime of violence. He was a young man. He was in his early 20s and was looking to Dogen for guidance. But they have a great kabuki actor playing Dogen. You can see a lot by just the look on his face, the look in his eyes. And he's looking at this Shogun, and at some point he goes, no, this guy's not really sincere. This guy is not really looking for the Dharma. He's looking for something, but this is this is a corruption. And there's an earlier scene in the film when Dogen first goes to China, and they said, "Why are you here?" And he says, "Well, I'm pursuing the Dharma. I'm seeking enlightenment." And they say, "Oh, you'll find enlightenment for yourself. Meanwhile, we're busy. We have to go and see the governor's office because he's going to give a donation to the temple." And Dogen said, rolls his eyes, and you can see that his view of the corruption. So I think that Dogen was always concerned from beginning to end with the antinomian tendency. And of course, there's a well-known story that the earliest Zen group, known as the Daruma school in Japan, a few decades before Dogen, and some of the ex-followers of that school joined Dogen. The Daruma school followers had that view that if you're one with the Dharma, then you can't do anything wrong. Everything is an expression of the Dharma, and good and evil blend together. So I think he was sensitive to it. And then going back to your comment about the corrective, but he didn't. He needed to tweak it. He needed to get it right. And then it was the breakthrough that he had after he returned for the shogun. Let me mention, and I think my good friend Taigen Dan Layton may be in the audience today, and of course he published Dogen's famous book, Dogen's Extensive Record, and there's a sermon there, volume 3, number 251, where it's the first sermon Dogen gave when he returned to Heiji from visiting the shogun, and he said, I know you're upset with me because I went and left the Heiji to teach to a secular authority, but I taught him the same thing I teach you guys. Cause and effect. Karma causality. Everything is based on doing good and mitigating evil. And he said, I know I have made a lot of mistakes in my own lifetime, but I'm here to correct it. So he made that statement. This was in, this would have been in the, in 1248, after he returned from that trip, about 5 years before he died. And then you can see there's a trajectory, and it's not only in the 12 Fascicles Collection, but there's many other passages in Dogen's extensive record, the Eihei Koloku, that are translated by Taigen and Shohaku Okamura, and other writings from the late period. So, you know, in the longer version, in the book version, I will build up all the documentation as well.
So, Stephen, a lot of people may read the 12 Fascicles thinking that it displaces the centrality of or emphasis on shikantaza and practice and paradox. Is that correct, or is it easy to see that both belong?
I think that definitely both belong, and the weight and the value and how the balance is drawn out. Those are individual decisions that we made by people studying and practicing Dogen's path. You know, the beginning of the 12 Fascicles, the first 3 chapters are, you know, become a renunciate, leave home, take the precepts, and wear the robes. And now he doesn't say do zazen in there specifically, but, you know, in his whole works, he only has a little bit of instruction on zazen. And in a way, you know, people say, like, you know, university teachers, they don't write a lot about how to teach. They write, you know, they do research on other kinds of topics. So I think he kind of took for granted, yes, people are still doing zazen, and people, you know, the practitioners are following the precepts, and they're doing the chores, and they're reciting the sutras, and there's the whole package of dignified behavior, dignified demeanor, upright behavior, moral rectitude is taking place. So this doesn't replace it, but it is a corrective in the sense that don't mistake the means for the end. Don't mistake zazen for enlightenment. And there's a fascicle, Shizen Bhikkhu, the 4th stage of meditation. And this goes back to early Buddhist sources. When you get to the 4th stage of meditation, that doesn't mean liberation necessarily. So it's a means to an end. Let me also mention, and in the title of the paper, I refer to another fascicle where he has the, he draws on an early Buddhist parable about 4 horses. And there's 4 kinds of horses. One kind of horse needs to be, feel the whip beating its flesh before it will run off. But the best kind of horse only needs to see the shadow of the whip. And so I think, you know, that's his admonition. That's his injunction to us. That's his instruction. You want to be in a position that you respond to the karmic conditioning and the need for repentance and cultivating wholesome roots by seeing the shadow of the whip. And shikantaza puts you in a perfect position to do that. There may be other ways of thinking and practicing that also put you in that position, but you're certainly not going to throw shikantaza by the wayside for the sake of moral behavior. And as one Japanese interpreter looking at that issue said, look, in shikantaza, you're not creating bad karma because you're not causing, you know, bad karma to happen. So by not creating it, you're contributing to the good karma. And it's a kind of simplistic point, but I think very important for this discussion.
You know, I have so many more questions, but I'd like to let our viewers ask some. So
okay.
Paul Genki Khan asks, Dogen's establishment of the Shinji for Heiji dictate almost all physical movements for practitioners in the monastery. Is this so different than dignified behavior in the 12 fascicle text? You want me to read that again?
Yes, yeah, no, I'm looking at it in the chat. So the Shin, I think Shingi are the monastic rules and regulations that a lot of which he had incorporated from Chinese sources that he had learned in China and was helping to introduce into the Japanese context. And it's true that that Heiji he was very concerned with the monastic regulations as well, before he wrote the 12 fascicles. So let's look at the timeline there. There's a collection also translated by Taigen Leighton, and Shoaku Okamura. Dogen on Dogen's monastic growth, pure standards. I can't remember the exact title, and there's 6 essays in there. If you look at the of the 6, 5 of them were written in the second half of Dogen's career. And a couple of them were written in the late 1240s period, in these last years of his life. So my view is that this would tend to support the emphasis on the Shingi, on the monastic regulations, tend to support that there was a gradual radical departure, that he was moving in that direction, and then at some point he took off on a sharper path in that direction.
Just a quick reminder to our viewers, please put your questions in the Q&A tab. We may overlook them in the chat. So if you put one in the chat, copy it and put it in the Q&A tab. Before we move on, Genki had a follow-up question. Isn't it a bit misleading to talk about Dogen at the end of his life? He was only 53 and became unexpectedly ill. So I guess the idea is the thoughts of an elderly man are in fact the thoughts of a 53-year-old who became suddenly ill, which back then might have been getting along in years. But
yeah, the life expectancy made it a little bit different. Although there are there are Zen teachers that we know from that period that we know. The famous Joshu or Jiaozhou was supposed to have lived to 120. So there were Methuselahs in the group. Well, but he was facing the end of his life. I mean, we don't know how long he was sick. We know that he didn't write much for the last. He didn't, produce much lectures or writing for over, for at least 8 months and maybe a little over a year of his life, and that maybe that was building up for a period of time. We know that in the and the trip after he returned to Kamakura, that there were a lot of different ways we can see that he's changing and getting a different perspective. But we know that the 12th fascicle, which Ejo says is the most important one, and this is the one that quotes the Buddha's sermon, was written in, that's the one week of the 12 that we can date, and it was the first lunar month of 1253, eight months before he died. So we know at that time he was conscious of it. And then since the others are edited in 1255, I think it's fair to assume that most of the other 11 of the 12 were written around the same time as the 12. So it was a time, he didn't get unexpectedly ill. I think that word may be a little misleading because, we don't know for sure how long he was ill, but he was ill for a period of time, and he knew he was facing his mortality.
okay, Jason McCauley asks, do we think Dogen's move toward a more dualistic notion of karma was an expedient device? One more way to point to the moon and meet folks where they were to give them a chance at starting along the path. Related to that is some people who might think these teachings were for lay people and the earlier Shobogenzo fascicles were for monastics, something like that.
Yeah. I think one thing is at Heiji, Dogen was facing the issue of how do you create a thriving monastic community up in the mountains, and where a lot of the potential followers were not as well educated as when he was in the capital in Kyoto, and they would have known, where they probably would have studied Chinese, and he was getting more countryside rural followers who needed to come up to speed, so to speak, on basic Buddhist teachings. So that's an argument that the traditionalists make for saying that the 12 fascicles was a kind of afterthought for for the novices, for the people being introduced to it, for who are hearing about it for the first time, who need to get the basics laid out for them in a straightforward way. And I think I think that, you know, that does hold up to some extent. On the other hand, it's you know, the first fascicle of the 12 fascicles is titled Shuke Kudoku, the merit of home leaving. Now, you could say, well, that's an instruction to people who are aspiring or thinking about it, or just dawning on them that maybe they should undertake this practice. But at the same time, the instructions are pretty intense. The writing is very you know, high level, in the sense that it draws on all these Buddhist sources, and it's not kind of watered down 1, 2, 3 ABC kind of writing that appears in the 12 fascicles either. So it's not fair to say. I don't think it's quite fair to say that this is like you know, TV dinner you take out of the oven and microwave to give to the lay followers. But I think what we could say is it's a legacy text, and this goes back to, you know, the late style, late period, Facing Mortality. That what's his legacy going to be? Now he knows he's got the Shobogenzo under his belt, so to speak. He knows that the Shobogenzo he has complete, and whether it's 75 fascicles or, you know, 60 or 95, probably he felt that needed any more attention. So now it's time to create one text that would be applicable. And my point here is that it would be just as applicable to serious advanced practitioners as to the aspiring, relatively uneducated aspirants.
Okay, so Shahryar Azar writes, was Dogen healthy late in his life, or was he sick? You answered that. People seem to change in late life facing mortality, whether sick or healthy. So could the 12 fascicles simply be the softening of Dogen, because the 12 seem radically different than evolutionary? So here's somebody who feels that they seem more radically different. To what extent was this caused by his age and facing the end of his life, I suppose?
Yeah. I think if you read that last one, Hachi Dainin, the 12th one, Hachi Dainin Gaku, the 8 lessons or the 8 teachings of a great person and an awakened person, and that's the one that Ajo says, you know, is the most important one and needs to be copied and upheld. In Ajo's postscript, it's a little hard to say grammatically. It's ambivalent whether he says cherish the 12th fascicle or cherish the 12 fascicles. So that little ambiguity leads to a lot of debate there. But yes, I would agree that point. Softening or mellowing may be a way to put it. Or it's a different worldview. It's a worldview that is based on the inspiration of the sutra that those 8 teachings are drawing from. So the sutra that of Shakyamuni's last sermon, I mean, one thing to take into account was that was used. That was popular in Japan, but I think it's one of the things that when he went to China, it had a different flavor in the Chinese Buddhist practice that he saw at the time compared to Japan. It was taken much more seriously. It was like something that was recited by monks, and including the abbots or the heads of the temples, you know, as they approach their death. You know, the Zen in China had also developed the idea where you write a last poem at the time of death, that the Zen master dies in the meditation position and writes one last verse, because they can foresee they can pretty much foresee the final moment of their death, and they prepare for it in zazen and by writing the poem. So there's other practices related to the 12 fascicles and other writings, including some poetry, that also augment what was happening in the late stage.
So Christopher Ives asks, Has anyone looked at the two texts in terms of the two truths theory? Shobogenzo non-duality is absolute truth, and the 12 fascicle text as conventional truth.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And on the spectrum here, where you have the traditionalists on one side arguing for consistency, continuity, it's Dogen through and through to the very end. The critical Buddhists on the other end are arguing for, a radical change that took place at some point in those last couple of years. And then the compromise view in the middle, I would put Chris Ives' suggestion, maybe center towards the traditionalist view. I'm still grappling it with myself. I mean, when I write it, I think the insights that I get, and I try to leave behind too much of the worry about is it radically different or not? But what is he saying? I mean, this is a message I want to bring out in the book length version of the study. But whether he changed or not, let's read this seriously, because it's not so much fun to read, and people read it and they say, oh, this doesn't sound like Dogen, because you want to paradox every other line. If you're not totally mystified and perplexed out of your mind, it's not really Dogen, but he does have a very interesting way of arguing the points. For example, in the householder fascicle, he starts out with the question like, what if you take the precepts and you break the precepts? Isn't it better to not take the precepts and not break them? And he says, no, it's better to take them and not and break them and repent and take them again. And now that's a very interesting argument that gets played out in many different ways in that fascicle called Shukkei Kadoku. So that's what I want to try to do, is to suggest that people look at it for the first time. In the new Soto Zen translation project translation published by University of Hawaii Press, the 12 fascicles are volume 6. So if you can get hold of that volume, and there are PDF versions available, or by the volume, you can see for yourselves.
Okay, regarding Dogen's ethics, wasn't he still under the Vinaya, and his writings reference the Chinese rule? Is it appropriate to understand the 12 fascicles as something closer to those?
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it. So there was a previous question about the Shingi. And I think that in his later stages, in a way it was gradual, in a way it was radical, that in the later stages, he's focusing on the behavioral instructions. There is one fascicle in the 12 fascicles, 108 gates that illumine the Dharma, and that's 108 instructions. And there's the 8 lessons of a great person. And so he's trying to give more detail, flesh out some of the precepts, give examples, show the pros and cons. Yeah.
Okay. An anonymous viewer asks, if Western Zen has largely framed practice around individual practice and meditation, how might Dogen's 12 fascicles challenge that paradigm? If he emphasizes morality and ethics and their karmic impact, he seems to point to the importance of monasticism, which enables that path fully. You mentioned in the paper that he might be trying to appeal to a larger audience, including the lay audience, in his deathbed writings. But this feels like Dogen is saying the path is the Buddha's traditional path of renunciation and monasticism. Okay, that's a long question.
Yeah.
See in the Q&A tab if you'd like to read it.
Pardon me?
You can see it in the Q&A tab if you wish to.
Yeah, I'm looking at it. It's very interesting question. I think that would take a lengthy answer, but let's draw out a point that we haven't quite gotten to yet, which is that critical Buddhism that I refer to made a big splash about the 12 Fascicle Collection in the 1980s. So some people know the story, others may be new. So in the 1980s, it was a time of intense nationalism in Japan, and the question of the kind of Zen at war. There wasn't a war, but the kind of Brian Victoria type of question was coming up. Was Zen capitulating to a nationalistic government and not thinking independently, being an independent voice for for ethical reason, so to speak. And then there was also a strong issue about social discrimination against the outcast community in Japan, and the tacit participation of all the Zen, of all the Buddhist sects in a kind of segregation, a de facto segregation that had existed in Japan, even though discrimination had been outlawed in the 1920s against the outcasts. And so what the critical Buddhism was saying is, like, if you look at the 12 fascicles, it's a template for approaching these ethical issues, whether it was in medieval times, Dogen's view of the shogun, or in contemporary times, our view of diversity and discrimination. Because there's an unwavering emphasis on making the choice between wholesome and unwholesome roots. But at the same time, Dogen doesn't give us any systematic approach there. And the critical Buddhists, who, you know, I worked with closely and admire their approach very much, and they're both long retired now. The main two figures are long retired now, but they never really developed that approach in, you know, they never really applied. They said it would be good to apply it to contemporary ethical issues, but they never actually did it, as far as I could see. And, you know, they just kind of ran out of steam maybe before they had a chance to do that. So I think that would be the stage that would need to be developed more.
Okay, I have to skip down to a short question because we're running out of time. I wish we had more time, but we don't.
Okay.
The question is from Mark Galula. It says, did Ejo write commentary on this collection of 12 fascicles? Did he write a commentary? If so, is there an English version with comments by Ejo of the 12 fascicle collection?
No, unfortunately, there were not, Ejo did not write a commentary. He wrote postscripts, which are very short. You know, there are just a couple sentences, or maybe the longest one is just 2 short paragraphs. So unfortunately, we did not have the traditional commentaries. Because the text was lost, then we don't have medieval commentaries or Edo period commentaries either, for the most part. So that was part of what I call a kind of revolution. And, you know, to use a Zen metaphor, it's like the result of the discovery of the 12 fascicles in 1927. It was kind of like the koan of pushing the buffalo's head and body and legs through the window, and you can't get the tail through. That the 12 fascicles was like the tail of the buffalo, that all of a sudden you had to rethink everything about Dogen because you couldn't get that through the window. Or I also evoke going, you know, showing my age, the old movie called The Mouse That Roared. Whereas, you know, the 12 fascicles was like a tiny text that roared. And, you know, what happened was that now we have detailed commentaries by modern scholars and practitioners in Japanese, but most of these, you know, haven't been translated and may never be translated because they're very intense. But I think a question, James, you might have asked me before we got started, were there different editions? Not, for the most part, not so much, but of course there were dozens and dozens of medieval texts that have been discovered since then, and there are minor variations here and there, and sometimes they're significant or not. Let me give one example where there is a significant difference. So Dogen uses, so a phrase that gets ascribed to Dogen that he doesn't actually literally use is called Zange Metsuzai, eradicating evil or sin or transgression through repentance. And people, that seems to be mentioned in the 12 fascicles. He doesn't actually say it that way, but it comes close enough. And the question is, if you look at different versions of it, what does he mean? Could that mean a simple, you know, Hail Mary gets rid of the repentance? You know, is a repentance that gets rid of sin? Would he be saying something so superficial and mechanical as that kind of ritual? Or does it point to the, you know, profoundly sincere nature of confession that can lead to, you know, a radical transformation, a metanoia, to use the Greek term? And so, you know, people have been parsing this one sentence where the term appears in different versions of the manuscripts that have been discovered over the time. So, you know, it's kind of painstaking work. It's fun for the people that like to do the grunt work in Dogen studies. Yeah.
Good. We're a little bit over, so if you could really quickly say is there a pub date for your book? And if so, does it have a title yet? Just so people know what to look for.
Yes. Well, I have been discussing it with University of Hawaii Press, who's published a new Soto Zen 8-volume translation of Shobo Genso, and with the 12 fascicles in volume 6, as I mentioned, and they're thinking this could be a good complement to that, and so I'm working with that goal in mind. Hopefully that'll pan out. The title. I thought about using the title "The Tiny Text That Roars," but people said I'm dating myself too much because that movie goes back too many years.
I remember the movie.
Yes, okay. So I know I'll use the title Dogen's Long Lost Last Text. I like that alliteration, and I may stick with the phrase Memento Mori, because I think that's one term that really captures it, and it's also true to earlier Dogen in the sense that they say that when his mother died at 7, at her funeral, as he saw the smoke rising from the incense, he felt deeply impermanent. So even then, he was facing his mortality.
Okay, so again, Stephen's paper is in the chat, so download it before we sign off. Thank you, Stephen, and thanks everyone for joining us. We'll drop the link to Stephen's paper in the chat again, which I just said, and we'll send a replay of this event in a follow-up email later today. Again, Tricycle is a nonprofit. If you'd like to subscribe, visit tricycle.org/subscribe. If you'd like to donate to Tricycle, visit tricycle.com/donate. And thanks again, everybody. And thank you, especially Stephen. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.